systems. Now, a system is really a very simple construct. It's all in the background material. It is a very simple construct because it is a means of classifying the components of the system so that you can talk about it, so that you can do analysis and arrive at findings which you run with the office of the minister, who then announces something extremely important. So it is not a major challenge, it's a classification issue. And a system is made up of actors. And the actors that we normally think about were listed by Indira: government, education, especially higher education, health and research institutions, business, enterprise, foreign institutions, and you can add others, private nonprofits, NGOs, trade associations, and we've got just about every element of the innovation system sitting in this room. The actors engage in activities, and I put R&D in bold, research and development, because a lot of people think research and development is innovation. It is only a small part, and the doing of R&D is not necessarily innovation. So I will get to that in a moment, but if somebody says we're spending X billion dollars on research and development, and we're the most innovative firm, government department, or what have you, in the country, they are. So we're also beginning to build a critical assessment of the terms. Activity. Linkages. And I would like you to think about linkages, because if we're going to talk about systems, it is the linkage that makes a system work. Without linkages, the system does not work. And were we economists, we would make some profound observation about system failure, instead of our usual comment about market failure. Systems can fail too. Linkages matter. And there are some examples of linkages. Linkages tie actors together. So cultural change is an issue. Culture matters. I can't stress that too strong. Summarizing then innovation systems, which I can apply at a local level, in which case people talk about clusters. I can take it across the globe in a value chain, in which case they call it the value chain. Listen to Professor Petro. I can apply it in a region, regional innovation systems, a country, national innovation systems. You'll find a big literature on that. And in the world of the Caribbean, you are experimenting with trade regions and cooperation, and at what level you put in place councils to advise and direct in the area of. So, the level is arbitrary, and that's why I'm saying the concept of innovation system is relatively easy to understand, virtually impossible to apply, and then to work with, but we'll get there. So the summary then is that the activity of innovation is dynamic. That means it changes rapidly, and it doesn't just change in one time scale. That's a point I would like you to hear. There are several time scales in an innovation system. If you're going to reform higher education, it takes decades. If you are going to launch a new app and make a lot of money by selling it on a platform like Apple provides for you, it can happen very quickly. So, short, medium, long-term time changes matter, and they all interact with one another. They can get in the way of one another as well as reinforcing them. The system is complex. You can go to complexity theory, or we can just say, we don't understand it either. It is nonlinear. Nonlinear simply means that by the time you've got all the positive and negative feedback loops interacting, if you come along as a policy person and you prod the system, for example, you put in place a tax credit, but there wasn't a tax credit for the doing of R&D, you may not get out the other side the result that you anticipated, because other policies embedded in the system may act against you, or they may reinforce what you are doing. Make two interventions, and they could easily cancel one another out or give you a negative result. So don't expect simplicity in system. That's any system, not just innovation system. And we are not alone, group. The world is out there doing things, and they're doing things to you. You, of course, are doing things to them. So we trade with China, and I think over the years we're going to see more trade with China. And that will be fascinating, but be careful. So, we've got our feedback loops. I work in China on occasion. I really like the country. But you have to be careful. Stocks and flows, multiple time scales, all make it difficult to link inputs with outputs. So if some evaluation person comes along and says, I am going to do an evaluation of your national system of innovation, whatever you do, don't give them any money, because it's very hard to do. If you're going to do evaluation, you can operate at project level. The project has got terms of reference, and you know what to expect. You know what the inputs are, the expected outputs, and you can do the effectiveness, efficiency thing, and write a large report. Don't try to evaluate the national system. So what I'm trying to convince you of here is that what we're talking about is not true. I would also like to make another key point. Everybody in this room is part of the system. So you cannot stand outside it and say, I am going to study it. Because if you are an academic and you do some case studies, you run a survey, you get some numbers, you write a report on a particular aspect of the system, trade, competitiveness, whatever is the flavor of the month, and you present it, the system reacts. And that is the interesting thing about systems. When you come along and say, the system does this, immediately thousands of little heads will look up and think, maybe not, and the system will do something different. Systems react in funny ways. So we are all part of the system. There is no escape. So the consultation is the issue. How do we have realistic consultation between agents that all have different stakes in the action? The Ministry of Finance knows it runs the country. Why is it talking to the Minister of Science and Technology? Ministers of Science and Technology are very vulnerable people. We should worry about them. And it's very hard being one. But if you're going to do innovation strategy, you have to have them at the table. You have to have the private sector at the table. Maybe international organizations, maybe civil society. People. If we're about to worry about putting a new pharmaceutical on the market, let me pick thalidomide out of the air, maybe having civil society at the table would be a good thing. Governance is a very serious issue, and at what level, and the key questions to guide evaluation. At the beginning I said evaluating innovation policy is almost impossible, but you do have to have some broad rules if you're going to maintain fiscal probity. So what are the questions that are going to guide your evaluation, and you better have those questions before you do policy. Ministers don't like that. And the ideal situation is you announce the policy, it appears in the newspaper, on the television, and everything is good. 3 years on, as the minister is about to run for election, he or she does not need to hear that this policy didn't achieve its objectives in the region. That we don't want to know. So the other observation about R&D is that, and the reason I'm spending time on R&D is that it is the most universally used indicator. It is highly concentrated. And what that means is you find that if you look at the top 5 R&D performers, there they are, they do 70% of the world's R&D. If you add the next 5 performers, so you've got the top 10, you're up to 83% of R&D. So that's it. Does the remaining 17% matter? Well, I can tell you it matters to you, how you make use of the formal creation of knowledge, which is what R&D is. The R&D is also, if you go into a country, highly concentrated in certain industries. So you will find pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, aerospace, and probably one of the big service industries that relies upon information communication technology, and maybe computer services. Take those 5, and no matter what country you're in, you're going to get 50 to 70% of the R&D performed in the country. So highly concentrated in industries, highly concentrated in countries, and then if you go into an industry and look at the R&D performance, it is highly concentrated in firms. So pick your industry, and the top 5 firms in that industry are going to be accounting for 50% or 40% of the R&D in that industry. Now, from a policy perspective, that means that you can do serious R&D policy, if that's what you want to do, by getting 30 or 40 CEOs into a room, buying them a drink, and talking to them about the issue. Interesting how rarely this happens. It does happen in Germany, but it certainly doesn't happen in Canada and not in the United States. But here, you could do it. You would find that you had a lot of multinationals in the room, but that is another issue you would have to play with. It's also a comment worth sticking in the back of your mind when somebody comes along and says, we are going to introduce a tax credit for the doing of R&D because it is universal. Everybody benefits from the tax credit. Not true. The leading industries in R&D performance, 5 of them maybe, benefit from the tax credit. Others benefit less. Boot and shoe manufacturers won't get a lot out of an R&D tax credit. So, it also has implications for surveys. The final point I would like to make, and this gets me back to the mainstream of my talk, is that in OECD countries, and it's certainly the case in Africa, Latin America, outside the Caribbean, and it will be true in the Caribbean, more firms innovate than do R&D. So is the issue innovation, or is the issue the formal creation of knowledge and its support? That's a question for you. If you're going to do innovation policy, you've got to get out there and worry about all those firms that find better ways of putting product on the street, but don't create formal knowledge. They learn by doing and using. And how you help them is not giving them an R&D tax credit. You perhaps give them a voucher which they can take up the road to the local community college and say, look, I can buy $10,000 worth of problem solving, and this is my problem. Can you help? And then the problem gets solved and the company grows or goes out of business, whichever. But you have given them a chance. And that is a case of having nothing to do with R&D. It has to do with problem solving. Or you can help them hire an engineer for a year who might also help them solve problems and change the way in which they think these are issues for you. Yes, question?
So, is it that, for example, we're in the region, we may have many innovative persons in the region, but because maybe there's an inability to capture that formal knowledge, from all other angles, one would think that, let's say, our communities are not as innovative in certain sectors. So in terms of looking at the whole system and trying to better whatever system that we have in place, isn't it just then to go back to capturing the formal knowledge and then making the connection, as you said, to the universities, blah, 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 blah. Am I understanding correctly what you're saying?
You've certainly got part of what I'm saying. Universities create knowledge. Great, well done, publish in a high-impact journal, get your promotion, move on, great stuff. But what we do with that knowledge, and there is then the question of how you move the knowledge from the academic environment into the private sector so they can take that knowledge and commercialize it and make money. So that is one linkage that we are talking about. But you have raised another case, which is a little different. And this is the region or the firm or firms that are able to innovate. They are innovative. They give people what they need in new forms, so they buy it, and that's good. And nobody's talking to them because, as far as we measure, this is the danger of indicators again, whatever we measure, we don't see them, they're invisible. But they're out there, and they are driving in their own way the economy. So how do we help those people? And that is a question I'm going to come back to. Both points are very good.
Right, but the issue of measurement now, and measuring R&D specifically, I mean, there are nuances in measuring services, let's say, versus manufacturing. And for this region, services plays a big role in terms of our economic development. But, I mean, I was just in attendance at another session where we were talking about actually measuring innovation in services. And there is a suggestion that we don't accurately capture innovation in services because of the mechanisms that are applied in measuring research and development broadly across them. Or if we're going to be discussing innovation policy based on indicators of innovation across the private sector in the region, should not be a consideration as well for discussion in terms of how we actively measure innovation at the sector level, versus in terms of services versus manufacturing versus what pharmaceuticals, whatever else is out there, and what currently drives the R&D measurements. It's very important to us, and I'm just wondering if we're going to be using this, as a platform for policy. Should we not also have a very involved discussion about what the indicators are?
Thank you. That is a good point. And you take us back to the debate about can we use the same guidelines for measuring innovation in the service sector as in manufacturing, as in agriculture? And that is a good point, and how we measure R&D also in these various sectors. And that has been debated quite a lot. One can argue, if we're talking about innovation, that a service firm knows when it's put a new product on the street. If you are selling insurance and you bundle two things together which you hadn't bundled together before, and you put it out there and people buy it, that is an innovation. And they can respond to the community innovation survey. And I think we can measure innovation in the service sector. And we'll come back to that very thing in the next lecture. So I'm glad you put that question on the table. Measuring R&D is another issue, because in manufacturing you tend to have, in the larger firms, an R&D group or unit which is separate. In a services firm, they tend to be smaller than manufacturing firms, and they may have a couple of people who create formal knowledge by playing with the products, but they wouldn't call themselves the R&D unit. So when the survey comes around, no, we don't do R&D. So that's a good point, and gets me back to the danger of indicating. Yes, Adira.
Hello. Yeah, just to continue with the same conversation that we're having. We measure, we tend to kind of say, okay, how much we spend on R&D, how much IPs we have, patents we have registered, all these are indicators of how innovative our society is. And to me, what you just said, in terms of these two things are too different, is really very, very revealing. And if I heard nothing else from you for the rest of the morning, I'm good. Got my money's worth. But I apply that in my mind now to the region. And really, our innovativeness is so under-registered. Because if I use, for example, music in the region, and what we have done with music, there's no money spent on R&D in it, but we have innovated in music within the industry itself. If you take, for example, soca and movement to soca chutney and all of these things, that's innovation taking place, but there is no mechanism that we have to record it. One example. A second example uses pepper sauce, where again, we have done so much within the industry. Very small individuals in their homes, in their kitchens, have created and have innovated on recipes that are just kind of inherited. R&D has come in after the fact to support that with respect to helping them, what do you do to lengthen the shelf life, etc. So to me, there is a role for R&D to support innovation and innovativeness, where just the doing and the changing, where it stops. And some of that is happening, but it is, how then, my bottom line is, how do we really measure this informal innovation that is taking place so that we can really better represent our creativity?
Thank you. You've raised the issue of the creative arts, and that is particularly important in the Caribbean because you do all sorts of interesting things. And it is an issue where you can, in principle, measure innovation. Because if you are a group of musicians, again, you know you just launched a new CD, a new product, it's out there, and it's either making money or not. All you have to do to be an innovator, by the way, according to Oslo, is get the thing to market. We don't ask whether it is good or bad, whether it makes money or does not, just that you get it to market. So that can be measured. The place of R&D is another issue, and I think we should be careful about talking about the formal creation of knowledge, which is what R&D is, which can be transmitted from universities to businesses or not, and what goes on in these small organizations that produce new or significantly improved products. The innovation you can measure there probably is no R&D at all there. And that's fine, so long as the policy is about innovation, because it's innovation which is making us the money. How do you measure it? You can do it through surveys or through case studies. With the creative sector, I would do it through case studies, build a number of case studies. You're actually taking my second lecture away, but that's okay. You build that up, and then eventually you find the people who produce this, which is CARICOM's Selected Economic Indicators, going up to 2008, a statistical profile of CARICOM's single market and economy, and get them to do some measurement. I've done the concentration. I've made the key point, which Indira developed, that more firms innovate than do R&D, and that's universal. Everywhere in the world, that is true. And that is because firms have to solve problems in order to survive. They've got to put something new out there so people will buy it, so they make money, and that goes right down to the people in African countries who run up to your car when you're stopped at a stop sign or a light and try to sell you something. They've got to make it a little different each time, and they do it. Government performs R&D, and they do a lot of mission R&D. So if you're doing environment, you need to know about environmental research, so you do it yourself. They support programs for R&D. They do procurement. They promote competitions. High-tech strategy in Germany is an example. And they support R&D indirectly. And the example there is tax credits or subsidizing staffing and training initiatives. So government departments can move into the private sector and try to change things. And we're back to the public sector, higher education, and government trying to facilitate the doing of innovation. And R&D is seen to be part of that. If I look at higher education and research institutes, you are producing highly qualified people, and we need the people to generate the knowledge, and that is extremely important. But another role is to have the absorptive capacity in the higher education sector, so you can grab knowledge which you see out there and bring it in, make it contextual, locally relevant, and then get it out so it can be sold. So how to measure the return on R&D investment in the public sector, if you really want to read about that, Rodman Hall's handbook is a good place to start. The desired outcomes of public sector R&D, the question is, you put a lot of money into it, is it generating what you actually want? And these are debates that you are going to have to face even if you are interested in innovation policy, only because government departments like to support R&D, because if they pick up UN books comparing countries, they see R&D, they see rankings, they want to play too. So you can't get around that, but the issue of innovation ought to be present throughout. So I am going to show you some scoreboards. The World Economic Forum, I think, is not a great place to go and look for inter-country comparisons, because it is based not just on measurement, but on a survey of executives, not a very big survey of executives who have opinions, and that can give rise to very interesting rankings. So scoreboards happen, and the indicators do include, and we've had mention of publications, patent citations, R&D expenditure and personnel, venture capital, trade in high-tech goods, which I personally find useless, statistics focusing on small and medium enterprises, and that's quite serious stuff, because one of the things in every country in the world is that if you look at your industrial distribution, you will find 95 to 98% of the firms in your country have fewer than 50 employees. 98%. A lot of the money is made at the 2% level because those are the big ones, but if you are an MP trying to get re-elected, you walk out of your constituency office, what you see is 90% of the businesses in your constituency are small or medium-sized enterprises. And that's why governments love SME policy. So what we're going to do now is take some of the knowledge that we gained in the previous session, and I'm going to try to apply it. So I look at all these things, and I see that all Charles's delightful small countries have a significant GDP ratio, which means that they are dominated by industry, exception Hong Kong, and look at the Netherlands and Norway. And what's different about Hong Kong is a lot of entrepot trade. They move things around. Similarly with the Netherlands, there are also some resources in the Netherlands. Think of the Dutch disease to an economist. We all try to avoid having the Dutch disease. Norway also has a lot of natural resources, so they function a little differently. All the others are dominated by the business sector. And look at the gross domestic product for a moment. And notice I always revert to the CIA if I have to find the number. They're very good at numbers. And other things. Now this we may not be able to see, but I am pulling out of this, those numbers. Now, all you have to see, if you can see it at all, are the GDP numbers going down the side. Now, these are US dollars, millions, and compare with the previous slide, US dollars purchasing power parity, millions. And you will notice 2 or 3 orders of magnitude difference. So, if I'm going to talk about small countries, there are small countries and there are small countries. So the first thing I learned about this, and you see how they are grouped, the first thing I learned about this is Caribbean countries are small. I'm an academic, I study things. No, that's good, but you already knew that. So the question that immediately leaps up is, do we have all the sectors, active sectors, needed to make an innovation system work? Notice I didn't say needed to make an innovation system, because it's there. Whatever country you're in, there's an innovation system. It may work, it may not work, it could work better if you put the policy in place to make it work better. So the question then is, can this be overcome by moving to various levels of aggregation, which you are experimenting with CARICOM, for example, and other activities. And this you know about, you are playing with. So what works? And that is where we get into some more questions.
Excuse me, before you go on, could you just expand on the abbreviations you had in DEIP, PNP, and HP abbreviations?
Oh, yes. Forgive me. Thank you for that question. I tend to live in a world of my own, as people are forever pointing out to me. Connecting to reality is probably a good thing. Business enterprise is BE, HE is higher education, Gov is government, and PNP is the private non-profit sector. Structure is not a bad thing. If we're going to do innovation policy, we should go and look at the odd number and see what we're trying to deal with. So if I'm in the Barbados, which I'm assured by my travel agent I am, we look at agriculture, industry, and services. And what we see, what we're doing there is breaking down GDP, and we're breaking down the labor market. So we observe that 3% of GDP is coming from agriculture, but it employs 10% of the labor market, and that means that the the people working in agriculture aren't getting as much of the GDP, of the money, as people working in industry. Here, industry is manufacturing, construction, and utilities, aggregation of those, not just manufacturing. And services is the whole service sector. So 83% of gross domestic product in this country is in the services sector, engaging 75% of the labor force, which means that they're doing relatively well if they work in services. Now, another point about economies. The industrialized economies around the world, I can walk into any of them and do, and point out, in fact, I quite enjoy doing this in resource-intensive economies, or the province of Alberta, Canada. I stumble into the lecture hall and I say, what's the leading industry in wherever I am? And in Alberta they will say, well, oil, gas. No, it's the financial sector. And if you don't have a big financial sector, you can't do business, you can't do deals, you can't move money around. I'm not talking about laundering here, I'm just talking about doing business. Laundering we do separate financial institutions. Well, not always, but you know more about that than I do, perhaps. So the services sector is important. The financial industry is of vital importance because that's what makes things go. But in addition, in 83% of your gross domestic product in Barbados, you have got tourism and you've got the moving of things around, transportation, logistics, shipping. Therefore, you need roads and ports to support the infrastructure argument. So knowing the economic structure of the country you're about to do policy in matters, because if you sort out agriculture and everybody is producing more coconuts to sell to my learned friend, then great, but it's not going to do much for the gross domestic product until you hear what he paid for the coconut. But I'm not going to give that away. So, in the case of Barbados, you focus on the service sector, but you don't neglect industry. We move to Jamaica, and we have people from Jamaica in the room, a bit more agriculture. The industry is stronger, and services a little less. So different game in Jamaica. And that really depends on what's going on in the industry, the activities. Trinidad and Tobago isn't really zero. I round everything, and I think it's 0.3, but getting rid of the decimal point, it's zero. Anyway, 4% of the population is working on zero agriculture. We look at industry and we see 59%, and there you've got a lot of natural resources being processed and shipped, bauxite, that sort of thing. And then the service sector is present, and the GDP labor ratio is really quite encouraging, so somebody's making money in Trinidad and Tobago. So you do this exercise, and you look at it, and that gives you some insight to how you're going to play with your innovation system. So I'm now going to take you back to the innovation system. We know what a system is because we talked about that. Well, I don't have to do that again, but I want to remind you that that's what we're talking about. And now, at what level are we going to play this game?
If I could just intervene, I think the point that that is being made here is that when we are approaching, building our innovation system, we need to understand what the structure of our economies are. And you made the point earlier, things like culture, history, things that, like, for example, the hurricane, all these things obviously will factor in. I don't think that us spending the time here to query whether the data is correct or what impacts it is as necessary as it is to understand how we go about just defining the structure of the economy so that the template really works for any economy, because it is about divvying it up by its GDP level and therefore getting a better understanding that will allow you to move forward in the process of how you define what is important, what are your priorities, where you want to focus. So that's the first thing. The second thing, in response to Nira, I heard from Fred very clearly that what we do is we define the criteria. We set them up, we decide at the very beginning of the process what is important to us. And I think too often we don't do that, or the way it is done is it's either driven from the minister who says, say, okay, this is what I want, and public servants just kind of follow through on it. So he says, I want an innovation system. So they just know they have to give the minister an innovation system. But to use the example with respect to cement, and if we take Trinidad and Tobago, to me, it would be government from a policy perspective would be make a decision. Is protecting the cement industry important enough? Whether it is driven by politics, interest group protection, or whatever, you simply have to make those kinds of decisions in terms of defining what it is. And to me, that really underscores the importance of bringing all the various stakeholders to the table in determining what those criteria are, so that it isn't really purely political or purely private sector or purely academia simply deciding, we just want to run whatever fancy programs you want. So that to me, it already underscores how important it is from the beginning to set up what are the criteria that you want, which will then inform the measurement of it at the end. And the issue that you were raising with respect to regional competitiveness, when we talk about the Caribbean, remember we're all sovereign nations, first and foremost. We've been trying to get the regional CARICOM, CSME thing going forever. And it's simply a work in progress, not really happening as fast as we would want it. And I'm, being trying to be very politically correct in, not wanting to raise any hornet's nest. But so that going at the regional level is something we certainly would want to go at, but we can't be starting there. Where we starting is at the country level. So let us look at our respective countries and end up, if we could get it right there to begin with, maybe we will have a basis on which to say, okay, how do we then pull it at the regional level?
Thank you, Indira. Before the wolves are unleashed, let me thank you for doing the summary of my talk.